Can someone please find out what that woman is doing on my firing line? The voice, belonging to Corporal Reyes, was laced with the kind of casual arrogance that only a 22-year-old top shot with a brand new, government-funded M2010 enhanced sniper rifle could muster. Master Sergeant Frank Wallace turned his head, the desert sun glinting off the lenses of his sunglasses. He followed Reyes's gaze down the long, shimmering line of firing positions. The range at Fort Irwin was a serious place, a theater of calculated violence where the Army's best came to push the limits of technology and skill. And there, at the far end, completely out of place amidst the digital camouflage, carbon fiber stocks and networked ballistic computers, was a small, stooped figure, an old woman. She looked like she'd taken a wrong turn on her way to a bingo game and ended up in a nest of wolves. She was dressed in faded jeans and a simple pale blue blouse, her gray hair pulled back in a neat, sensible bun. The only thing she carried was a long, narrow case that looked more suited for a delicate musical instrument than anything meant for a live fire range. Wallace sighed, the sound a low rasp in the dry air. It was his job as range safety officer to handle this. Usually, it was a young lieutenant who wandered into the wrong impact zone, or a civilian contractor who forgot his hearing protection. This was a new one. He started the long walk down the concrete platform, the crack of a .338 Lapua Magnum echoing from a few lanes over, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The young soldiers, a mix of Rangers and Delta trainees, watched him go. He could feel their smirks. The old woman was an amusing distraction, a break in the high-stakes monotony of their training. He saw Reyes lean over to his spotter, Private Chen, and whisper something. Chen barked a laugh. Wallace's jaw tightened. He didn't like his range being treated like a circus. He approached the woman, planning his words, gentle but firm. "Ma'am, this is a restricted military area. You need to leave." Simple. As he got closer, however, the simple plan began to fray. The first thing he noticed was her posture. She wasn't stooped from age, not really. She was coiled. There was an economy to her stillness, a centeredness that was completely at odds with her frail appearance. Her back, though bent, was straight in a way that spoke of discipline, not infirmity. When she turned her head slightly, sensing his approach, he saw her eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue, framed by a web of deep wrinkles. But they weren't the soft, wandering eyes of a lost grandmother. They were sharp, analytical. They didn't just see him, they assessed him. They noted his rank, his posture, the slight wear on the grip of his service pistol. In a fraction of a second, she had taken his measure with an unnerving efficiency. He came to a stop a few feet away, his pre-planned speech dying on his tongue. "Ma'am," he began, his voice softer than he intended, "this is a live fire range. It's not safe for civilians." She offered him a small, polite smile. "I have permission, Master Sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, with a faint, unplaceable accent. It was as steady as her gaze. She held up a laminated visitor's pass signed by the base commander himself. Wallace stared at it. It was legitimate. His carefully ordered world tilted a few degrees. He looked down at the case at her feet. It was worn brown leather, scuffed at the corners, the brass latches tarnished with age. It looked like a case for a target pistol, maybe an old Hammerly. "What are you planning on shooting with, ma'am?" he asked, his curiosity overriding his annoyance. The snickering from down the line was growing louder. She didn't seem to notice it, or if she did, she gave no sign. With deliberate, unhurried movements, she knelt down. Her knees didn't crack. Her motion was a smooth, practiced hinge. She undid the latches and opened the case. The soldiers who had started to wander over to watch the show fell silent. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, was not a pistol. It was a rifle, but it was unlike any rifle they had ever seen. The stock was dark walnut, scarred and nicked from decades of use, the wood worn smooth where a cheek and a hand would rest. The action was a Mauser-style bolt, polished to a dull sheen by countless cycles. The barrel was long and heavy, but its bluing was faded to a soft gray in places. It was a relic, a museum piece. Attached to it was a long brass scope that looked like something out of a Jules Verne novel. Reyes finally broke the silence. "Holy smokes," he snorted, unable to contain himself. "Is that a Mosin? Did you pull that thing off a dead Russian from World War II?" Chen giggled. "Careful, Corporal. She might be a ghost. The woman ignored them completely. Her focus was entirely on the rifle. She lifted it from the case with a reverence that was almost maternal. Wallace could see now that it wasn't a standard-issue weapon of any kind. It was a custom build, or perhaps a heavily modified classic. The action was smooth as glass when she worked the bolt. The trigger looked hand-tuned. Every part of it, though ancient, was immaculately clean. She handled it not like an antique, but like an extension of her own body. "She's going to need a tetanus shot just from touching that thing," Reyes muttered to his friends, just loud enough for everyone to hear. The woman paused, her hand resting on the rifle's stock. She looked up, her pale eyes finding Reyes down the line. She didn't scowl or say a word. She just looked at him, and for the first time, Wallace saw the young corporal's smirk falter. There was a weight in her gaze that his youthful confidence couldn't quite deflect. The main event of the day was about to begin. A high-speed, long-range drone was being prepped for launch. The exercise was designed to simulate taking out a high-value enemy combatant in a moving vehicle from an extreme distance. The target would be moving erratically at 2,400 meters. For a sniper, it was the ultimate test of skill, technology, and instinct. The atmospheric conditions were a nightmare. A heat mirage shimmered off the desert floor, distorting the air, and a fickle, gusting wind whipped across the range, changing direction every few seconds. Reyes was up first. He was the unit's golden boy, a natural marksman whose abilities were amplified by the best equipment money could buy. He lay prone, his state-of-the-art rifle looking like a futuristic weapon system next to the old woman's piece of history. His spotter fed him data from a Kestrel weather meter and a ballistic calculator. Wind is 7 miles per hour, shifting from 1 o'clock. Mirage is moderate. Give it 9 mils of elevation, 2.2 left on windage, Chen chanted, his voice a calm, professional murmur. The drone launched, a black speck against the brilliant blue sky. It moved fast, zipping left and right. Reyes tracked it, his breathing controlled. "Sending," he said calmly, and the M2010 coughed, a sharp, flat report. They all watched the vapor trail of the bullet through their optics, a faint ripple in the air. It was a good shot, but the wind gusted at the last second. "Miss, just high and right," the spotter called out in frustration. Reyes cursed under his breath and cycled the bolt. Another sniper, a seasoned sergeant first class, took his turn. Another miss. The drone was simply too fast, the wind too unpredictable. The window of opportunity was closing. The range control officer was about to call off the exercise. It was then that the old woman spoke, her quiet voice cutting through the tense silence. "Master Sergeant," she said, looking at Wallace, "if the young men are finished, may I have a turn?" The request was so absurd, so completely out of left field, that for a moment, nobody knew how to react. Then came the laughter. It started with Reyes and Chen and spread down the line. It wasn't just a snicker this time, it was open, incredulous mockery. "With that old thing," Reyes laughed, gesturing at her rifle, "you'll be lucky to hit the mountain behind the target, Grandma." Wallace felt a flush of anger, both at the disrespect and at the woman for putting him in this position. Every regulation in the book screamed at him to say no. She was a civilian. That weapon wasn't certified. The risk was enormous. He opened his mouth to refuse, to end the ridiculous spectacle once and for all. But he looked at her again. She was standing perfectly still, weathering the storm of their ridicule with a profound and unshakable calm. He saw the way her hands rested, steady as granite. He saw the way her eyes weren't on the laughing soldiers, but on the windsocks far downrange, reading their subtle dance. He thought of the signature on her pass. General Morrison, a man who did not suffer fools and did not grant favors lightly. A cold nod of intuition formed in Wallace's gut. This was more than it seemed. "One shot," Wallace heard himself say, the words coming out before he could stop them. "You get one shot, ma'am." The laughter died instantly, replaced by stunned silence. Reyes looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Master Sergeant, are you serious?" Wallace ignored him, his eyes locked on the woman. "One shot." She simply nodded, a flicker of something that might have been gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you." The soldiers watched, a captive audience to a play they no longer understood. The woman, Anya, as Wallace had read on her pass, didn't lie down in the standard prone position. Instead, she sat, crossing her legs in a way that looked almost meditative. She settled the rifle, using a simple leather sandbag for a rest instead of a modern bipod. She didn't have a spotter or a wind meter. She pulled a small, worn leather notebook and a stub of a pencil from her pocket. She closed her eyes for a long moment, and Wallace could have sworn he saw her lips move, a silent prayer or a mantra. Then she opened them, and they were different, sharper, more focused. She licked the tip of her index finger and held it up, turning it slowly. She scribbled a few notes in her book. Her calculations were done in her head, drawn from a well of experience so deep it was unimaginable. She turned the large, unmarked brass knobs on her scope, the clicks precise and audible in the renewed silence. The young soldiers exchanged confused glances. Their own preparations were a symphony of technology and teamwork. Hers was a silent, solitary ritual. It was arcane, it was ancient, and it was utterly mesmerizing. She settled her cheek against the worn wood of the stock, and it was like watching two old friends embrace. She became part of the rifle. Her breathing slowed until it was almost non-existent. The drone was nearing the end of its run, its movements becoming even more erratic as the operator tried to evade the previous shots. It was now or never. Wallace raised his own binoculars, his heart pounding against his ribs. He didn't know what he was expecting, but the tension was thicker than the desert heat. Reyes was watching through his high-powered scope, a look of pure disbelief on his face. Anya's finger rested on the trigger. She didn't pull it. She waited. The drone zigged left. She waited. It zagged right. Still, she waited. She wasn't aiming at where it was, or even where it was going to be. She was waiting for something else, a moment only she could see. Then, the drone made a small, almost imperceptible dip as it passed through an air pocket. In that infinitesimal pause, that single beat of stillness in its frantic dance, her rifle spoke. The sound was not the sharp crack of the modern rounds. It was a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very air, a voice from another era. It kicked up a cloud of dust around her, but she didn't move. She remained perfectly still, her eyes still pressed to the scope, watching her own work fly across the vast expanse. For 3 long seconds, there was nothing but the echo of the shot fading into the mountains. Reyes let out a short, derisive puff of air, about to declare the miss. Then, a voice crackled over the range radio, raw with astonishment. "Hit! I repeat, we have a direct hit. Target destroyed." Wallace swung his binoculars back to the drone's flight path, just in time to see the black speck blossom into a puff of smoke and debris. It tumbled from the sky, trailing wires and shattered composites, a direct, catastrophic impact, at 2,400 meters, on a moving target in a gusting crosswind with a rifle that belonged in a museum. The firing line was utterly, profoundly silent. The only sound was the wind. The young soldiers stood frozen, their mouths agape. They looked from the falling wreckage to the old woman, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and shame. Reyes slowly lowered his rifle, his expression completely blank. The entire foundation of his world, his skill, his technology, his superiority, had been demolished by a single impossible shot from a ghost. Wallace walked toward her, his boots feeling heavy on the concrete. He felt like he was approaching a monument. She was already working the bolt, ejecting the spent casing. A plume of smoke curled from the chamber, smelling of old cordite. She caught the hot brass in her gloved hand before it could touch the ground. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look proud. She simply looked satisfied, as if she had just finished a familiar, comforting task. "Ma'am," Wallace said, his voice hoarse, That was the finest piece of marksmanship I have ever witnessed." She finally looked up at him, her eyes the same calm blue as before. "The wind tells you everything," she said softly. "You just have to be quiet enough to listen. The machines are loud. They make the young men forget how to hear it." She began to wipe down the rifle with an oilcloth, her movements as practiced and certain as her shooting. Reyes and Chen approached, hesitant and humbled. They stopped a respectful distance away. Reyes, the arrogant corporal, looked like a chastened schoolboy. "Ma'am," he stammered, unable to meet her eyes. I apologize for my conduct. I don't have words for what that was." Anya looked at the young man, really looked at him, and her expression softened. "You have talent," she said, her voice kind. "You see the target. but you do not see the space between. The air is not empty. It is a river. You cannot fight the river. You must learn to flow with it. She held out the spent casing to him. It was a huge, bottlenecked cartridge he didn't recognize. This rifle and I, we have been together a long time. We have learned to listen together. Reyes took the casing. It was still warm. He stared at it as if it were a holy relic. The head stamp was Cyrillic. Before Wallace could ask the questions burning in his mind, who are you? Where did you serve? How is this possible? She was packing the rifle away. She laid it back in its velvet nest, closed the lid, and fastened the tarnished latches. She stood up, her movements fluid and graceful. She gave Master Sergeant Wallace a small nod of thanks. Then, without another word, she picked up her case and walked away, heading back toward the administrative buildings. She didn't look back. The soldiers watched her go, a silent, respectful honor guard. They watched until her small figure was just a speck in the shimmering heat. Wallace stood there for a long time, the silence on his range feeling heavier and more meaningful than the earlier noise. He looked at his elite soldiers, at their humbled faces, and the new light of understanding in their eyes. In 10 minutes, this old woman had taught them more about humility, respect, and the true nature of their craft than a year of conventional training ever could. He knew he would never get the full story. He suspected her name wasn't Anya, that her visitor's pass was a fabrication to hide a legend. He imagined the stories that Rifle could tell, the cold wars and shadowy conflicts it had seen. He walked over to the spot where she had sat. Lying on the ground, almost invisible against the concrete, was the small stub of a pencil she had dropped. He picked it up. It was worn down, the wood smoothed by the same hands that had held the rifle. It was a simple, ordinary thing, but he knew it was the key. It wasn't the rifle, or the scope, or the bullet. It was the quiet mind that guided them, the patient heart that knew when to wait, and the steady hand that had written its own history in a little leather book, one impossible shot at a time. He slipped the pencil into his pocket, a reminder that the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield is the one you can't see.